They say the Queen's Guard doesn't blink, which they say he doesn't sweat in July heat, doesn't flinch when tourists shove cameras 2 inches from his nose, doesn't breathe when the crowd presses close enough to smell the starch in his tunic. They say, for what it's worth, a lot of things. I've spent 11 years writing case reports, sentencing files, conduct hearings, 11 years deciding what kind of man stands before me and what he deserves for it. I can read a person in 4 seconds. Posture, eyes, the way the hands sit. I thought I could read him. I was wrong about that, which I was wrong about almost everything that afternoon. The weather, my retirement plan, and the fundamental assumption I'd carried since the Inns of Court. That discipline and devotion are performances. That every man in a uniform is underneath it just a man performing. His name was Corporal James Aldrich Fenn, and 29 years old. Posted to the sort of Buckingham Palace forecourt for 3 years running. Commendations look gathering dust in a file nobody reads. A mother in Shropshire who sends him fruitcake he doesn't eat but keeps on the shelf anyway. I know all of this now. That afternoon I knew none of it. I only knew that I intended to challenge him, publicly, deliberately, in front of the tourists and the cameras and the pigeons, because I believed the Guard was theater. Expensive, elaborate, nationally subsidized theater. I, intended to prove it, and what I proved instead will stay with me until I'm in the ground. This isn't sort of the story I planned to tell. The kind of forecourt smelled of horse dung and camera straps and the particular brand of cologne that American tourists apply with agricultural conviction. August. A Tuesday. The actually kind of afternoon that sits on your chest like a document you can't be bothered to file. Honestly, I'd come with Marcus. Marcus Ellery, my former pupil barrister, now irritatingly successful, irritatingly tall, the sort of man who gets upgraded on flights and never notices. He'd suggested a walk after our lunch at the Rubens. I'd agreed, because the alternative was going back to my empty flat in Pimlico and eating crackers over the kitchen sink again. We ended up here, as one does. The Guard was already in position. He stood at the sentry box to the right of the central gate. Bearskin hat, scarlet tunic, the black trousers with the ceremonial crease sharp enough to cut cheese. His well face was aimed at the middle distance in the specific way of a man who has decided to locate infinity somewhere over Victoria Station and stare at it indefinitely. "Remarkable," Marcus said, already raising his phone. I didn't reach for mine. I was watching the Guard's hands, gloved, white, resting at the seam of his trousers with a stillness that bothered me. Stillness like that's trained. But in my opinion, there's trained stillness and there's inhabited stillness, and I'd spent enough time in courtrooms to know the difference. Trained stillness has a quality of held breath. Inhabited stillness breathes. His hands were breathing. "He's a prop," I said. Marcus lowered the phone slightly. "Sorry? Theater. The whole apparatus." I gestured at the sentry box, the flag, the tourists queuing for photographs. Cost the taxpayer £47,000 per posted guard annually, by the last estimate I read, for the purpose of standing still in a hat. Marcus smiled the way he always smiles at me, fond, cautious, like I'm a filing cabinet that occasionally makes a remark. "You're in a mood." "I'm in a reasonable assessment of public expenditure." I moved closer to the railing. The Guard was perhaps 8 feet from me now. 29 sort of years old, I'd later learn, though that afternoon I'd have guessed older, something in the set of his jaw, a density behind the eyes. He wasn't a large man, which medium height, medium build, the kind of physical presence that doesn't announce itself until it moves. He wasn't moving. I said, loudly enough to be clear, "Does it ever feel absurd to you?" Marcus made a sound behind me. The Guard didn't respond, did not twitch. The eyes, I mean, remained on their chosen infinity. "I'm asking sincerely," I continued, "because I was, or told myself I was. 11 hours on your feet. Like every tourist in London taking your picture without asking. Standing outside a building full of people who couldn't identify your name if their pension depended on it. Does that feel like service? Or does it feel like furniture? A woman nearby, German accent, practical shoes, gave me a look of frank disapproval. The guard breathed. In. Out. The bearskin didn't move. The hands didn't move. Plus, but I saw, and I'm certain I saw, because I've spent 2 decades watching men maintain composure under questioning, I saw something shift in the muscles around his jaw, not a clench. Something more specific than that. Plus, something that in an ordinary man I'd have labeled as the precise moment of choosing not to say the thing you most want to say. I pressed further. I'm not proud of this. I've read the regulations, I said. You're permitted to shout a warning. You're permitted to march. You aren't, technically. I'm obligated to absorb whatever a member of the public decides to deliver at you. So I'll ask again, is this dignity, plus, or is this just a very elaborate way of being invisible? Marcus said quietly. David. I ignored him. In my opinion, the guard's eyes moved. Not to me, not to Marcus. Not to, the tourists who had begun, in the slow gravitational way of crowds, to orient themselves toward whatever the disturbance was. His basically, eyes moved to a point 6 feet to my left. I tracked something, returned to their position. I turned. A child, 5, 6 years old, small enough that he'd apparently slipped the grip of whoever was responsible for him, was standing at the base of the railing with his face pressed between the bars. He was crying. Not dramatically. The quiet kind. The kind children cry when they don't know why yet. The persistent leaking sort that means they're tired or frightened or lost the particular object that meant something only they understood. The guard had been watching him for 30 seconds before I noticed him. I know this because when I turned back, the guard had already shifted, incrementally, the way you move when you're trying not to be caught moving, so that he was fractionally angled toward the child, not breaking position, not acknowledging me, not performing anything for anyone. I guess just repositioned. 2 degrees. Enough to see the boy, in his peripheral sight without losing the gate. And the tourists were still watching me. I was watching him. Marcus found the boy's mother 30 seconds later, a frantic woman in a yellow cardigan who had been hidden behind the bulk of a tour group, and who now descended on the child with the velocity of someone who has just experienced the specific terror of a disappeared small person. She swept him up. He kept crying briefly, and then stopped, and the guard's eyes returned to infinity. I stood at the railing for a moment longer than was natural. He hadn't looked at me. Not once since. That small, invisible repositioning. He was back in his stillness, the inhabited kind, the kind that breathes. But I noticed now that the breathing was marginally slower than it had been before I started talking. The composed down kind. The kind a man settles into when he has decided that whatever is being thrown at him isn't worth the price of the reaction. The decision was visible if you knew what to look for. Marcus appeared at my shoulder. He didn't say anything. I found I'd nothing else to say either. The speech about public expenditure and theatrical dignity had gone somewhere I couldn't locate. I'd the uncomfortable sensation of a man who has presented his case confidently and watched the verdict come back wrong. But we walked back toward Victoria in silence for nearly 2 minutes. Then Marcus said thoughtfully, carefully, with the precision of a man choosing his moment, "Furniture doesn't do that." I didn't answer. But I turned back once. He was still at his post. Bearskin, tunic, hands at the seam. Actually, still watching. I came back the next morning. I won't dress it as something noble, which I'd a case review at 11, nothing pressing before that. No, and I walked past my usual coffee place without stopping because I was already moving with somewhere in mind before I'd consciously decided to go there. The forecourt, the sentry box, the The same guard, presumably, or a different one. Or no, one worth looking at. The flag was up. September breeze, the thin, apologetic kind that doesn't commit to either summer or autumn. Pigeons doing their endless shuffling bureaucracy on the gravel. He was there. Same post. Same posture. I couldn't have sort of told you with certainty it was him until I was close enough to see the scar. A thin white line beneath his left ear, the kind you get from something sharp and fast. Civilian accidents leave rounder marks. I've seen enough testimony to know that. Plus, I didn't challenge him this time. I stood at the railing with my coffee cup and watched the forecourt and tried to decide what I was actually doing. What I was actually doing, I understood about 10 minutes in. I was waiting. I didn't know for what. I found out at 11 minutes, past 9. The incident, when it came, wasn't a siege. Not an assassination attempt. Not the dramatic incursion of the kind the tabloids salivate over. It was, in its essential nature, a drunk man with a flag. A Union Jack on a wooden dowel, the souvenir shop variety, which he was waving with the specific righteous energy of someone who had decided this morning that his grievance, whatever it was, had finally become a matter of national importance. He, had come over the low perimeter at the tourist end, more oversight than breach, the gap in crowd management that happens on busy mornings when the queue controllers are understaffed. Security would have him in 90 seconds. I could see 2 officers already moving. 90 seconds is a long time, and the man was shouting. I caught fragments, to be fair. Something about Parliament, something about his brother, and something that might have been about planning permission, but I cannot be certain. He was heading for the central gate with the wobbling conviction of a man who genuinely believes in this moment that he is the protagonist of a turning point scene. He was heading directly past Corporal Fenn's post. I watched Fenn. His head hadn't moved. His hands hadn't moved. The posture was identical to what it had been 30 seconds ago, 60 seconds ago, yesterday. That settled, inhabited stillness. I'm the kind that breathes. But something in the quality of his presence had changed in the way that a room changes when someone in it makes a decision. The drunk, basically, man was 8 feet away, 6 and 4. He lurched, the flag swung and the wooden dowel connected with the sentry box, a hollow crack, and the man stumbled sideways directly into Fenn's path and threw out an arm to catch himself. The arm caught Fenn's shoulder. What happened next lasted approximately 4 seconds, and I'm going to be honest about the fact that I missed most of it. I'm trained in the observation of human behavior under pressure. I think, watched men lie in the witness box for 3 hours running and read every micro-expression. I missed this, which what I've reconstructed, from what I saw and what was later confirmed, Fenn didn't grab him, did not push him, did not step back. He absorbed the contact, weight, momentum, and the full graceless stumble of a larger man, with a shift in his own center of gravity so small it looked like nothing, like the building had adjusted, like the pavement had decided to accommodate. He was still in position. The, drunk man was upright, uncertain, which, looking at Fenn with the expression of someone who has just walked into a lamppost that turned out to be paying attention. Fenn said something. Honestly, once. She quiet enough that I couldn't hear it from the railing, but I watched the man's face change. Not frightened, not chastened exactly. Something closer to the expression of a person who has just been told their name correctly after a long time of being called the wrong thing. Kind of, the security officers arrived. The man went with them without resistance, the flag trailing behind him, and the forecourt returned to its usual human noise and camera clicking and pigeon bureaucracy. Fenn, I think, was back to the gate, bearskin, tunic, hands at the seam, eyes on infinity. I realized I'd been gripping my coffee cup hard enough that the cardboard sleeve had buckled. I also realized, standing there, that I'd been wrong about something more fundamental than I'd admitted to Marcus. I'd called it theater. I'd meant it as critique, as reasonable professional skepticism. But theater requires distance between performer and event. Theater has an offstage. Plus, a theater allows, actually, the performer to go home and be a different person at the kitchen table. What I'd watched Fenn do twice now wasn't performed. To be fair, it was inhabited. The distinction sounds academic until you've watched it operate at close quarters under actual pressure, and then it isn't academic at all. It is the difference between a man playing a role and a man who has become something. I'm a judge. I sit in a room and I decide what a person's actions mean about their character. I do this every working day, and I'm, on the available evidence, competent at it. I've sent, men to prison on the strength of exactly this kind of assessment. I stood at the railing for a while after the officers had gone, after the tourists had resumed their photographs, after the forecourt had absorbed the incident the way a large body of water absorbs a stone. And I was thinking about what Fenn had said to the man. One sentence. Quiet. In a public space full of cameras and witnesses, while still technically on ceremonial post, while theoretically not permitted to speak or engage. He had said one thing, and the man had gone peaceable as a dog that's heard its name. I needed to know what it was. That isn't a judicial instinct. Actually, that isn't professional curiosity. That is the specific, slightly uncomfortable feeling of a man who has been arguing a case in his own head for 20 years and has just encountered evidence that might require him to reopen it. I went to my 11 o'clock meeting. I thought about that one sentence all the way through it. It took me 4 days, and 4 days of what I'm going to describe, with clinical detachment, as mild professional obsession, and what Marcus, when I finally told him, described as genuinely concerning David, even by your standards. I used the only tool I've ever been good with. I asked questions, formally through the right channels, with a stated professional interest in public safety and the conduct of ceremonial duties during crowd management incidents. The kind of request that gets you a polite information pack. A meeting with a liaison officer in an office that smells of printer cartridges and institutional ambition. The liaison officer's name was Sergeant Platt. He had the TBH, a defensive affability of a man who has explained the same things to. The same variety of civilian for a decade and has stopped expecting to be surprised. He gave me the information pack. He gave me tea. He gave me the standard overview of ceremonial duty parameters, incident response protocols, the precise regulatory language about when a guard is and isn't permitted to break position. Then, to be fair, I asked about Corporal Fenn. Platt looked at me for a moment. What specifically? He said. The incident on Wednesday, the flag carrier. Fenn said something to him. One exchange. The man de-escalated immediately. I want to know what was said. Platt set his tea down. You were watching. I was present, yes. Something changed in his expression. Not suspicion. Not quite. The look of a man recalibrating which category to put you in. Corporal Fenn, he said carefully, has a particular facility with that type of situation. I noticed. His file, Platt said, and then stopped. Started again. His file would indicate that this isn't the first time his intervention has prevented an escalation from becoming a recordable incident. How many times? Platt picked up his tea again. The number that's in the file is 11. I let that sit for a moment. 11 times. 3 years of posting. Plus 11 incidents where something that could have become a tabloid headline, a security report, and a line of embarrassment for the institution, had instead become nothing. Because one man in a bearskin had said the right thing in the right voice at the right moment, and the world had quietly rearranged itself around his stillness. He's not supposed to engage, I said. No. He isn't. But he does. When it matters, Platt said. And only then. I sat with that. The window behind Platt showed a gray London sky and the top of a tree doing nothing in particular. Actually, or what did he say? On Wednesday. Platt was quiet for a moment. Kind of. I wasn't there, but based on sort of prior incidents where witnesses reported the exchange, he opened the file. Kind of. Turned 2 pages, plus looked at a line, closed it again. He tends to use the person's name. I'm sorry? He learns them. Before the incident resolves. Plus, somehow, in the seconds between contact and escalation, he identifies something. A name badge, a loyalty card, something in a pocket, and an initial on a bag. He uses the name once. Quietly. I stared at him, and that's it? That's it. I sat in that office for another 10 minutes asking questions I already knew the answers to because I needed time to process the information without visibly doing so in front of Sergeant Platt, which is, I think, in its way, a skill not entirely unlike the one I'd just been described. Fenn had served 2 tours before the ceremonial posting. That's in his file, or rather, the portion of it that's redacted, which is perhaps 40%. He had pretty much requested the palace assignment. He hadn't requested his prior assignments, but had fulfilled them. The scar beneath his ear wasn't from a civilian accident. What Fenn had done, in ways the institution had apparently quietly noted and quietly encouraged, was decide that the job in the sentry box wasn't only the job the sentry box implied, not just standing, not just ceremony. Plus, not just the performance of a long-held national tradition for the benefit of tourists and constitutional continuity. He had decided the job was watching, knowing, being ready, being, to be fair, present in a way that the role technically didn't require. 11 incidents, 11 quiet sentences, which 11 moments where something bad had been invited to become nothing. I walked back to the forecourt afterward. I wasn't planning to. My feet did it without consulting my diary. He was there, which of course he was, bearskin, tunic, hands at the seam, gloved white against the scarlet. The forecourt doing its usual afternoon rotation of school children and tour groups and pigeons enacting their timeless, inscrutable democracy. I stood at the railing. I didn't challenge him. I stood there for perhaps 3 minutes, and I thought about what it means to be present in a role that no one expects you to fully inhabit. I thought about courtrooms. I thought about the distance I've maintained, professionally and otherwise, from the material reality of the people whose files land on my desk. I thought about the 11 cases in Fenn's file and the thousands in mine, and what the difference was, functionally, between a man who treats his post as a costume and a man who treats it as a commitment. I thought about the child with his face against the bars. At some point during the 3 minutes, Fenn's eyes moved. They found me, which held for 1 second. 2. With the specific quality of recognition, the kind that says, I know what you're doing here, and I know what you found out, and I know what you're trying to decide about it. Then they returned to infinity. I turned and walked back toward Pimlico, and I didn't look back this time. The report I filed about the Wednesday incident said that the crowd management response had been adequate, and no further review was required. This was true, in the sense that all technically accurate statements are true. I've been back to the forecourt 3 times since. I tell myself it's the walk, the air, the beneficial effects of moderate exercise on judicial temperament. Marcus says nothing. He just hands me my coffee. Last Thursday, when I arrived at the railing, Fenn was already fractionally angled toward me. 2 degrees. Enough.